Most people walking through Lichfield today would never imagine this city was once nearly destroyed by fire. People drift through Market Square without thinking twice about the ground beneath them, and the old lanes still bend and narrow in ways that quietly betray their medieval origins. But more than 700 years ago, this city experienced what appears to have been the single greatest urban disaster in its history. In the year 1291, a great fire swept through medieval Lichfield, and according to historical sources, consumed almost the entire city together with the friary, demolishing the greater portion of the town itself. Churches were caught in the destruction, including St Mary's in the Market Square, and yet somehow the Cathedral Close appears to have escaped untouched. And it's that contrast that's one of the most fascinating parts of the entire story, because outside the close stood the crowded civilian town, a place built largely from timber frames, wattle and daub walls and straw-thatched roofs, where homes, workshops, inns and market buildings stood packed tightly together along narrow streets, while inside the close stood stronger stone religious buildings separated behind walls and gateways. In towns like medieval Lichfield, once flames reached the rooftops, fire could spread with devastating and terrific speed, and it's not difficult to imagine why. Open hearths or fires burned consistently inside homes. Candles and rushlights illuminated buildings at night, burning on animal fat. Blacksmiths and bakers worked around heat and flame every day, and almost every structure in the city itself was effectively fuel waiting to burn. Somewhere here in Lichfield in 1291 that exact nightmare began. I still don't know exactly where the fire started, and no surviving eyewitness account has yet been found describing the first flame. And no known medieval source explains whether the disaster began accidentally, through negligence, or somewhere within the crowded market areas themselves. But what the surviving records do make clear is the scale of destruction left behind afterwards. One of the places worst affected was the Franciscan Friary, founded in 1229 by Bishop Stavenby. The Great Fire complex had spent decades growing into one of the major religious sites within the city, and by 1286 King Edward I had even supplied oak from Cannock Chase to help complete the buildings there. But yet only a few years later the fire completely destroyed it. Decades of work almost gone immediately. Historical accounts state that the fire consumed almost the whole city together with the friary, and afterwards the complex had to be rebuilt slightly west of its original position, meaning the disaster physically altered part of medieval Lichfield itself. The city didn't simply repair the damage and carry on, parts of it had to be rebuilt differently, and beneath modern Lichfield, traces of that older world still survive underground. During excavations carried out in the 1930s, archaeologists uncovered remains connected to the old friary site, included buried walls, passageways, decorative floor tiles and foundations hidden beneath the modern surface. Physical remnants of the medieval complex destroyed in the fire of 1291, and then slowly buried beneath centuries of rebuilding afterwards. Which means that beneath roads, gardens and public spaces that people casually walk across every day, parts of the buried medieval city are still lying there underneath. Another church caught in the destruction was St Mary's in Market Square. Later historical writings describe the fire enveloping the church itself before rebuilding work later took place under Bishop Walter Langton. He became Bishop of Coventry in Lichfield only a few years after the disaster. Again, this reinforces something important about the fire. This was not a small localised blaze affecting one district or one street. The damage appears to have spread across large sections of the medieval town. And yet strangely, despite how catastrophic the fire appears to have been, very little survives describing the human side of it all. There are no surviving detailed descriptions of panic in the streets, no records of families fleeing with possessions. There's also no death toll of which I can find, and no clear account describing how the fire was finally stopped. What survived instead was the rebuilding afterwards, the archaeology beneath the ground, and the civic memory that much of Lichfield had once been consumed by flames. And perhaps that memory lasted longer than people realise, because in the centuries afterwards, Lichfield became deeply organised around fire prevention. Historical records from later centuries describe firefighting equipment and hand-operated fire engines being stationed around the city near places like St Mary's, the Market, Wade Street and the Guildhall. In fact, a window at the Guildhall was taken out and rebuilt with an arch big enough to fit a fire engine. There was also ladders known as lathers, and hooks called croons. used for dragging burning roofs down into the street before flames could spread further. Every able-bodied man in the city could be called upon to help fight fires, while conduits, standpipes and water carts became increasingly important to the city's defence against another major outbreak. And that conduit detail becomes especially interesting when placed next to the fire itself, because only around 10 years after the disaster of 1291, water from the crucifix conduit was being supplied towards the Friary area. Now, there's no direct evidence proving this happened because of the fire, and it's probably important that I don't overstate its connection, but it does hint at a city rebuilding, reorganising and improving itself after a catastrophe. Medieval water systems were expensive civic projects, and later records repeatedly connected Lichfield's conduits and water supplies to firefighting efforts throughout the city. In other words, the fear of urban fire does not seem to have disappeared from Lichfield after 1291. And when you walk through places like Boar Street, Bird Street, Market Street or Dam Street today, you may still be following routes that existed when the fire swept through the city over 700 years ago. The shops and the buildings they sit in have changed. Entire sections of medieval Lichfield disappeared and were rebuilt, but the shape of the city itself still quietly preserves echoes of the world that burned here. And that's probably the strangest part of the story. Modern Lichfield feels peaceful, historic and untouched in places, but underneath the city that people see today is the memory of a medieval disaster, so severe that historical sources claimed almost the whole place was consumed by fire, back in a time when Lichfield only had a population of 1,500.